Dear colleagues, thanks for the waiting. As I understand, the Commissioner is in the building and coming towards the conference hall. But before that, it is fourth and the last session of our conference. Like the previous ones, we have 1.5 hours for it. And in this session, we will hear about and discuss the challenges for EU budget. The European Commission has presented the reflection paper on the future of EU finances. New policy areas, different crises, and withdrawal of one member state, all these burden and challenge the EU budget. Since the current multi-annual financial framework ends in 2020, a new MFF has to be negotiated. And I'm keen to hear what the future EU budget should focus on and how the EU budget should be financed, but also how to cope with the challenges, ensuring greater flexibility at the same time. And now let me introduce you our distinguished speakers. The first speaker is European Commissioner Mr. Günther Oettinger, and the second speaker is Ms. Isabelle THOMAS from the European Parliament. After the keynote speeches, I will give the word to my co-chair, Märt, who is a Deputy Minister of Finance in Estonia. And to remind you, dear colleagues, you can sign up for the debate already. Now, I would like to warmly welcome our first keynote speaker for this session, Mr. Günther Oettinger, the European Commissioner for the Budget and Human Resources. Prior to that, he was the European Commissioner for Digital Economy and Society. Mr. Oettinger, the floor is yours.
Verehrter Herr Vorsitzender, lieber Herr Minister,
Chairman,
KIVINE, verehrte Frau
Minister KIVINE, Madam Thomas, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the European Parliament and the national parliaments, ladies and gentlemen. The Commission very much welcomes that today and yesterday you have been discussing essential issues of our financial monetary strategy, and by doing that are making an important contribution for the important steps that we will be taking. With the white paper, the Commission has presented deliberations on the future of Europe. The budget is not an end in itself. There's income and expenditure in order to finance goals, projects. So the question is, what do we want to do with Europe in the next decade? That's what we should be focusing on. With the budget of 2018, we are moving into the last stages of the negotiations, and we're preparing the budgetary framework for the next decade, a binding multi-annual financial framework which will set the foundation for the budget of the next decade. We have identified two gaps, two problems. On the one hand, an income gap. Depending on the transition period, when Great Britain will have left the European Union, and due to the fact that the United Kingdom is a net payer, we will be seeing 12 to 15 billion euros of income less. And as there are new tasks that are better and more efficiently dealt with at the European level, we are also seeing expenditure problems. This includes border control, border protection. This includes migration and dealing with the refugee situation in general. This includes the Turkey-EU agreement in order to finance human dignity where refugees are insufficiently housed at the moment. This includes the issue of internal and external security, defense research, and the defense industry. Now, this second gap is estimated to be around 10 billion euros, so the important question we have to ask ourselves is, how can we close these gaps, the income, i.e. revenue gap, and the expenditure gap. Now, my plan is to very strictly focus on proving the added value with the European budget. No euro, no cent should be financed and invested at the European level without really providing an added value. Investments and expenditure at the national or local level have to be efficient as well. So, on the other hand, I want to ask the parliamentarians from national parliaments that when we are able to prove an added value, that they give us the funds in order to activate this added value for the benefit of the European taxpayer so that we can efficiently invest at the European level. I want to invite you to discuss this interesting question of what does an added value actually mean? When do we identify added values? Let me give you some examples. First example, defense research. When it comes to defense research, we are still acting on individual basis, but we do not need to develop 10 defense AUVs. So a common defense budget leads to an added value, or defense industry. In Europe, we have 180 different types of weapons. Our American friends have 28. For each dollar, the United States gets 1.6 times the service from the arms industry, whereas we only get €1 back. So it would make sense to have standardizations, co-financing when talking about the defense industry. If we want to take the 2% goal of NATO seriously, some countries are at 1.4%, some countries are at 1.2%, but if we want to take the 2% goal seriously, we have to get from 210 billion to 310 billion, so 100 billion more. But 60 billion would be sufficient if part of the investments were coordinated at the European level, if there were more standardization, and if there were co-financing from the European budget. That would be an added value. In the past, the member states frequently told us there is no added value. But let me ask you, are national parliamentarians willing to give us the money whenever we can prove an added value? Second example. If we have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and maybe Finland and Poland as well, and if we simultaneously expand the railway system, and by doing that, integrate the entire region, and if we co-finance that based on the Connecting Europe facility, then this translates into a clear added value for the region as compared to a merely national funding. That would be a railway. Similar thing would be a railway connection from the Danube along the Black Sea. So cross-border infrastructure. And third example, when talking about high-performance computing, which is my former area of expertise, digital technologies. Of the 10 most high-performing big computers in the world, we only have one in the European Union. We are lagging behind. But what we don't need is 27 supercomputers. What we need are 2 to 3 for the European industry that does research and for the research institutes at our institutes of higher education. That's why we have a high-performance computing program at the European level and the co-funding for 2 or 3 supercomputers for the entire European industry. And now let me give you a counter-example. If we build a regional train from Sofia to the rural areas in Bulgaria, only in Bulgaria, does that mean there's an added value? Well, budget experts say, no, that's something that the national budget is responsible for. I can tell you there is an added value because the national budget will not be able to cope with it. It is an added value if we succeed in increasing the GDP per capita of our European citizens. If you look at the value creation per capita in Europe, the European average is 30,000 euros per capita. The peak in Europe, which is Luxembourg, 90,000 euros per capita. My home country, or that of Ms. Thomas, 40 to 45,000 euros per capita. Bulgaria, 6,500 per capita. And that's where we also found Estonia, which is today at 20,000 euros per capita. So we can prove that without cohesion funds, money, Estonia wouldn't be where it is today. But we need to pursue this path further. The distance from 6,500 to 90,000 shall not remain this big. Otherwise, it will destroy Europe. The European Union is a union of solidarity. And by that, I don't mean that Luxembourg needs to be reduced from 9,000 to 6,500, but rather Bulgaria needs to increase from 6,500 to 20,000, 30,000. We need to try to cover the distance. And the question is, are the net payers willing to accept this as an added value when we talk about structural falls, when we talk about funding the regional train lines from Sofia to the rural areas in Bulgaria, and by doing that make the entire region more attractive for investors, and by doing that give Bulgaria the opportunity to catch up with the European average. At the moment, we're working on these two big gaps, and we have two different ways of doing that. The Brexit gap, which will be 15 to 20 billion euro, and my proposal is that 50% of that gap will be covered by cost savings in the budget and 50% by putting in fresh money. The second gap, the new tasks for the European Union, defense research, etc., migration, or development aid to counter refugee flows from Mali and Niger in 2025 needs to be covered on the basis of fresh money. We do not want to see further cuts in agricultural cohesion or connecting Europe programs. At the moment, we are conducting a spending review. We are very thoroughly looking at where we need to improve, where we need to simplify and modernize, where we can basically save money. It's a process that will continue until the end of the year, and our reflection paper presents a plethora of questions that will be important for the MFF of the next decade. Do we want to have co-financing in the second pillar of the agricultural sector? Do we want to have higher contributions from the member states for the cohesion funds, etc., etc.? Now, I want to propose that we do away with the rebates. The mother of all rebates was the Margaret Thatcher rebate, the biggest rebate. That will disappear. So we should think about whether our budget and the generation of income whether this cannot be simplified. And we can say if the mother of all rebates leaves Europe, then the children of all rebates might as well leave Europe. I think I also want to stress timing. I want to jointly think about what we can learn from the past. In the past, we had the proposal of the Barroso Commission, which was presented in June of 2011. This year, we would have to present another proposal prior to the end of the year. The Council and Parliament were willing to grant us a little bit more time until May of next year so that we can include the outcomes of the Brexit negotiations and that we can assess the white paper process. So next year in May we will present a framework for the budget as we did in June 2011. But when you ask the budget experts from the member states, where does this idea come from that at the end of 2017 we can present a budgetary framework that begins on January 1st, 2021? Well, nonetheless, that was based on a decision of the Council. That's what the member states wanted. Now we'll present our proposal in May of next year. But at that time, nothing happened in 2011-2012. Only in the second semester of 2013 did the deliberations begin. Prime Minister Cameron said less than 1% of European GDP. That's what he said. Some heads of government assisted him because they wanted to keep him in the European Union. Well, that was a mission impossible. And in December of 2013, we had a new financial framework. And this was definitely too late, because implementing this into laws, implementing this into legislation led to a situation where no new funds were used and earmarked for new projects, and it led to a situation where in 2014 our farmers didn't receive any money because the implementation rules hadn't yet been decided. So that's why I am asking you, shouldn't we come to an earlier decision on the next financial framework? And we have another special problem. Last time we had one commission, the Barroso Commission, and one parliament. This time we are seeing a rupture here, because in June of 2019 we have elections to the European Parliament. So when it comes to the deliberations and negotiations concerning a new multi-annual framework, we have two potential windows of opportunity. The usual window of opportunity would be the Commission presents in May of next year, and then nothing will happen for quite some time. Then there's the election campaign with the candidates, a European election, and then the Parliament needs to come together. Then we have the summer break, summer recess, and then there will be the hearings of the candidates for the next Commission. And then there will be the new Commission starting November 1st, 2019. A candidate will become president of the Commission. Candidates usually make promises during election campaigns, and some of them they have to also fulfill, not all of them, but some of them. So that means changing our draft for a multi-annual framework. That means the deliberations will begin in February 2020, the earliest, with a new parliament, with modifications, with amendments, with at least 2/3 of the commissioners being newly appointed. And in December of 2020, these deliberations will come to an end. And as a consequence, 2021 will be a year where no money will be available for structural projects and the agricultural sector in the rural area. Another lost year. Now, learning from the past. And that's why I propose, and I'm offering the member states and their parliaments, as well as the European Parliament, the closest possible cooperation and inclusion here. So if the when the Commission presents its proposal for a budgetary framework post-2020, we would like to immediately begin with the negotiations in Parliament, in the Council, and between Parliament, Council and Commission, with the ambitious idea that under the Bulgarian and Austrian and Romanian presidency, we might discuss for 1 year in a very intense way, so that in April, May 2019 we will finish and will be able to present a new financial framework prior to the election to the European Parliament. And that would be a very smart move, because by doing that we could show to the public, to the investors, to our citizens that we are able to act. The United Kingdom is leaving, and simultaneously we agree on one of the most difficult areas, namely between net payers and cohesion fund users, on a new budgetary framework for the new decade, for the next decade. Please allow me to address the net paying countries in the hall, because we are thinking about how this strong dependency of national payments can be diversified to a certain extent, because it's clear that in the national public of Sweden, Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Italy, we see that the media is only paying attention to how much money is directed at Brussels and how much money is coming back. It's the net payer position, which I can understand, but I'm telling you, and I'm going to prove this using the example of my home country, every euro that is transferred from Berlin to Brussels to Ljubljana, to Sofia, Prague, or Bratislava, or Warsaw, and which is co-financed by the national budgets there, up to 70% go back to the ordering books of the Western European companies, mechanical engineering, materials companies, mechanical engineering tools, construction companies, trucks, engineering offices, architecture offices, etc. And this means that the internal market and the European structural funds lead to a clear increase of revenue and profit in those industries of basically Western Europe that are responsible for building the infrastructure and implementing projects in the new member states. And that is particularly why I would ask you to take off your net payer hat and put on the common good hat of Europe. I would be very much interested in a detailed exchange of views with you for the next weeks, because if your governments in your parliaments wants to pass a budgetary proposal, they always need a majority in one chamber or two chambers of your parliament. But for a European budgetary framework for 5 to 7 years, we need a majority in the European Parliament. That's doable, but we need unanimity with 27 member states, their governments and parliaments. And my request is, imagine you'd need unanimity, 27 ministers of financial affairs, 27 foreign ministers, 27 premiers, and your parliaments. Just imagine this. I am hoping that you participate. I am offering transparency on all numbers, all deliberations, and I'm asking you for flexibility. If we have a situation where nobody changes their position a little bit, we end up with no compromise. The worst case would be the British leave the European Union and the remaining member states do not succeed in achieving an agreement on the multi-annual framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oettinger. And now I'm delighted to give the floor to Ms. Isabelle THOMAS, member of the Committee on Budgets of European Parliament, Co-Rapporteur on the reflection paper on the future of EU finances and on the next MFF. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay. I will speak in French. Monsieur le représentant du gouvernement estonien, Monsieur le vice-président de la Commission des finances du Parlement estonien,
President, Vice President of the Estonian Parliament Finance Committee, ladies and gentlemen, and Mr. Commissioner Oettinger, dear colleagues. So, first of all, I would like to thank you for having invited the Budgetary Committee to participate here, and I can express the opinion of the European Parliament regarding the challenges facing us. There was a resolution we just adopted, and I would like to discuss this. It is a very important topic when it comes to the future of the EU, because if we talk about the budget of the EU and the next multi-annual financial framework, means that we talk about the European project, and we talk about the tools the project will have and what are the objectives. Now, regarding the current situation, then 2013 was the first time in the history when the Union adopted the multi-annual financial framework, which is smaller than the one preceding it. But at the same time, we had one country extra, Croatia, acceded. Right now, the budget of the EU is about 1% of the GDP of the member states and 2% of the public expenditure. The reality which our co-citizens are not often familiar with is that this kind of ridiculous budget of the European Union, this 2%, is meant for huge tasks. This is something which enables us to maintain minimum conditions for sovereignty and allows us to simplify the movement of students, guarantee the convergence through cohesion policies. So this is meant to support our single market and is fighting against the forces trying to focus their powers in certain locations. So this is fight for our common future. That means we're looking at the harmonization of investments and living together. But this underfinancing has an impact on the EU policies as well. We need to take a new look at the budgetary issues, and this is what we covered in our new resolution of the European Parliament we adopted last week. As you just heard from the Commissioners Oettinger and Gretto, if we would like to guarantee the functioning of the budget, we need to answer two questions. First of all, what are the objectives of the EU and how we can achieve these objectives? The EU cannot have ambitious objectives with this kind of budget, which is constantly being reduced. If we have a stagnation of the budget, it leads us to fragmentation of our tools and therefore less efficiency. At the moment, I would like to remind you of the Article 311 of TFEU, because the EU has to have the means in order to achieve the objectives and implement the policies, but we are not doing it. So this is what we have to tell to the Council, and I hope we can all tell it also to Mr. Oettinger, that you are demanding the impossible. You are requesting that we do more with less. We need to find solutions for crises, attacks, migration problems, agriculture, so forth. So for two questions: what are the governments doing, and what is the European Union doing? How can we foresee the budgetary capabilities and new lines for the Eurozone if we are not allowing for additional financial means? How we can say they would like to implement new priorities such as the security and defense, which are important for all of us. At the same time, we have the budget which do not allow it, because our budget does not allow us to respond to these challenges, and the current financial framework every year, ever since 2014, is just taking something away from one in order to give a little bit extra to somebody else. So how we can demand that the EU is active in all the important areas with a budget which is ever smaller? The parliamentary resolution we adopted last week discussing the budget of the EU, we would like to see 20% of increase. And if we look at all the obligations which have been laid upon us, then all these aspects cannot harm the objectives we already have. The Security and Defense Union cannot be implemented on the expense of the cohesion or the employment of the youth. So we have to take into account the responsibilities they have. The weakness of the EU budget, which we're facing right now, we know that there will be additional impact, which is due to Brexit. As the Commissioner said, we have a net payer of the EU contributing about 9 to 12 billion per year, which will have less. So we need to compensate the exit of the UK. So in order to see the glasses half full, we need to review our revenues. As the Commissioner says, we are seeing also the end of the British rebate, which gives us all a possibility to discuss the other rebates which exist. So the end of the rebates gives us greater transparency and balance. Based on this, we need to discuss the potential revenues. Our European budget is based on three sources of financing. So first of all, we have traditional revenues, the custom revenues. Then we have the VAT, 12.3%, and we have the gross national income, which is 69%. Approximately. So these figures show us that the EU revenue depends on all the member states. At the same time, we cannot forget that until the 90s, it was all based on own revenue, and the proportion was actually reversed. This system is actually based on perverse logic that every government every year has to make these choices between their own budget and the budget of the EU. Now, this is the logic which has led to this logic of the just rebate or the fair rebate, and the finances being returned to the member countries. But this same logic has caused this vicious circle or the spiral of ever-declining budgetary income. Because if we want to take this seriously, then of course, on one hand, we're looking at the reducing revenues of the member states, but more task has to mean more means in order to implement them. And if we want to end this I want my money back principle, we need to move very quickly back everything which has to do with the own resources. The next multi-annual financial framework is allowing us to implement the reform, because the budget of the EU has to finance from the revenue which creates additional value on the EU level. The Mario Monti working group regarding the own resources made their own proposals. So we're talking about the financial transaction taxation. So this is somewhat unclear. So then we have the tax on carbon and the CCCTB. So this is another aspect which can be put to use. So if you look at the big gaps and the fraud related to VAT, this is another aspect which needs some good review. Now I would like to move on to the review role carried out by the European Parliament. This is something which was discussed last week during our plenary session, because we would like to turn attention to the democratic review of the budget. This is under the competency of the national parliaments. We have many mechanisms. We have the discharge procedures, the financial obligations, approvals. So there are many ways and means, but the responsibility of the review or of the control exists in all the democratic countries, and it's related to the balance of powers. I would like to draw the attention of the members of the parliament to the fact that there are many financial instruments which have moved outside, and therefore the parliament has lost its power of control. For example, it has to do with the European Investment Bank functions. But there are so many different funds. For example, the Turkey Fund. And these funds form an exception to the Article 310 of TFEU, and therefore they're excluded from the parliamentary control. So all these things which are outside the budget become something which is outside the democratic process, and this budgetary issue is a very sensitive one. Now, concerning the EFSI and the stability mechanism, then we need to look at the financing which comes from additional means. The role of the Parliament in the decision-making process, which is carried out based on different additional lines of budget, then there are many other priorities, there are many other discussions which are being held regarding the next multi-annual financial framework. Now, if we look at the duration, then there are many possibilities. Last Tuesday, in the parliamentary resolution, the European Parliament stated that the Parliament would like to apply this duration so it would allow for long-term stability of investment, because this foreseeability and flexibility is something which is very important for the Parliament. The Parliament would like to see that the level of expenses would correspond to the priorities of the EU, and therefore it is very important that the financing which is accessible will be sufficient and they would correspond to the objectives. And for every new objective, there is a corresponding financing source. So we wouldn't have new priorities without the means of implementing them, because the EU budget has to correspond to the priorities of the EU. Budget is something which we all develop together in the Council, the governments, but it is all done in cooperation with all of you, the parliaments of the member states, because you are the ones who represent all the EU citizens, and we need to all participate in this debate, what it is, what we'd like to achieve in the EU. So we know that this total is more than the sum of its parts. So this is what is important for me. If we look at the globalization, the transnational impact of crisis, the border management, climate change, we need to face also these global storms which impact our ability to function alone. So therefore, we have created this kind of sovereignty which allows the Europeans to guide our own future. What happens sometimes, and what is important for us to face, is this that we cannot really close in upon ourselves, because the budget does not lie. It reflects the political constructions which are current, and it talks about the politics and the choices we make. I would like to thank the Estonian presidency for me to exchange my thoughts on this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Now we have around 45 minutes for the discussion, and we will start with the interventions, and then dear panelists can give their answers and comments. So we will start with Mr. Olle Felten from Sweden, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that Brexit puts, when the money from UK will not appear in the wallet anymore, the finger on the main problem for the EU. The EU budget reflects the ambition for the EU activities from the member states. At the same time, the EU administration sets its own ambition in a way, and then demand for more money to achieve their goals. This is not a way forward for the EU budget. From my point of view, the Swedish contribution to the EU budget is already far too high. So the EU must act in a way similar to the speech from Mr. Ardo Hansen yesterday, and that is to prioritize, improve effectiveness, and act for quality more than quantity. More money in the budget is not a way to achieve the goal, but it is a way to walk in the opposite direction. Another important thing is to throw the ambition to create an EU taxation capability in order to improve the own resources in the trash can. If not, I think it will cause a lot of trouble for the EU in the future. So, from my point of view, the way forward is to concentrate on the most important issues and improve quality and effectiveness. It's not to improve expenditures. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Ms. María del Mar Angulo from Spain.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I'd like to put on the table one of the most important challenges that we have to face. That's the demographic challenge. It is it's a very major challenge in many regions in Europe. We have a decreasing population, and we have a scattered population, and also an aging population. It is a major challenge, and most in our country, the countries of all the regional presidents, of all the regional governments have taken measures, and a committee in the Senate has been created to face up to this challenge. But I think that we need also to react from the European Union. The demographic challenges should be tackled at European level. The European agenda cannot forget the demographic challenges. We cannot put it aside. We have seen that European policies have been a very useful tool to respond to those common threats, threats and challenges that we face. We needed to give a comprehensive, integrated solution. We need to act from the budgetary side as well. There are some decisions from the political level, and I know that different institutions such as the Committee of the Regions, others have been dealing with this, but the budget is a major tool here in three ways: quality and accessibility of services, that is of capital importance when facing this challenge, and then decisions on a local level, for instance, specific financing for those areas where there is a depopulation that is on the rise, and thirdly, by creating jobs, employment, and projects that are creating a high added value. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mr. Antonio Costa Silva from Portugal.
Obrigado, Sr. Presidente. When we ask the question which is the focus of the European Union and which lines should be supported by future budgets, I do not think there can be any hesitation that has to be supported by economic growth. Europe has to be people-centered. This is a great difference between the European Union and the other countries and the regions of the world. Asking citizens, asking companies for new taxes or more tax burden is absurd. The tax burden is already too heavy and inhibition freedoms. That is why it is vital to ensure a sustainable, balanced and a balanced economic system based on very clear and rigorous rules. Of course, the European Union has to create more wealth. It is clear that the European Union has to export more, not just some country, but all of the European Union. The community budget and future prospects must be focused on the new realities. More destructive climate changes, more complex demographic change, more complex and diversified social responses, instability in different territories, more complex labor market. Europe should remain open to the entry of the new countries. The European Union must be focused on the new challenge. It is to be able to predict the future if there can be the risk of failing quickly. Of course, we must remain focused on competitiveness, innovation and knowledge. It is clear that the European Union must remain an area of values. It's to defend them strongly. It is clear that the European must continue to seek economic, social and territorial cohesion. It is clear that the European Union must continue on education and create more equitable social systems. Do you believe in the new budget based on a model of economic growth with further taxes? Do you believe that the European Union is able to respond to all these challenges? Should not the new financial perspectives for 2027-2029 and this budget more flexible, capable to incorporating these changes? Thank you.
Thank you. Please keep your interventions in 2 minutes. I just saw that I have a bell here, so I will use it next time. And now Mr. Norbert Brackmann from Germany, please.
First of all, I would like to thank Commissioner Oettinger for using the key term today. I believe the key term is the term added value, and not the added value for Europe or the nation states, but the added value for Europe and the nation states together, because subsidiarity and this particular added value are two sides of the same coin. They are indivisibly linked, and they also constitute the key for the success in the eyes of our citizens, because this is the added value that we need to explain to our citizens, and we need to explain it in an European election where this question comes up again and again. Why do we have to finance the European institutions? Why do we afford ourselves these institutions? And I think this is a very important aspect. And in times where many countries see a rising nationalism, we will only be able to be convincing advocates for Europe if we can explain this added value for the nation states as well. That's the only way forward. But I'd like to ask two questions. As much as I can understand the time frame that Mr. Oettinger has presented, it shows that in the election campaign that will be held for the European election, it shows how relatively important the European Parliament is if we define in this financial framework which funds are made available for which task. And that's a question. And the second question refers to the Brexit costs. So far, the figures communicated were 10 billion. Today, we heard 12 to 15. I would like to hear more about where these new figures come from.
Thank you. And now Mr. Dimitrios Mardas from Greece, please.
Regarding the EU budget receipts, probably a Tobin-style tax on all transactions of all stock markets can solve in part the problem. Regarding expenditures, we have to reinforce expenditures in the field of immigrants and refugees issues, and we have seen that the new style unanimity of the treaty didn't operate in the appropriate way so far as the EU budget is concerned, very recently this. And we have seen that trends on national sovereignty operated against European challenges and threats. As for the security and defense policy, we of course agree to Commissioner approach, according to which we have to rationalize production and research development expenditures. This can have a positive impact on EU funds dealing with these issues. However, we have to take into consideration any kind of traditional threats dealing with external policy. And following the experience that we have, we can see that these threats are concentrated to Southern Eastern Europe. And many of these threats are related to the associated countries to the EU. In this context, all these issues have to be taken into account seriously, and all these issues and the reinforcement of expenditures dealing with these two fields are fully compatible to Article 3 of the treaty, dealing with solidarity, Articles 21 and 42 of the treaty dealing with external and security policy, and Articles 78 to 80 dealing with the refugees and the immigrants issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Ms. Maria Plus from Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the UK leaves EU, Sweden demands for a decreasing budget. We also ask for the EU to be more effective and to focus on questions that has to be handled across natural borders. We want EU to reprioritize within the EU budget to the benefit of common actions, as, for example, migration, security, fight against terrorism, and research. This can be done through decreasing agricultural support and less structural funds. We also ask for more effective control of the use of EU funds. This is also more important if the EU budget is to be decreased. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mr. Antonio Misiani from Italy.
Grazie Presidente, io condivido molto quanto scritto dalla Commissione.
Thank you, Chairman. I share what the Commission wrote in its reflection paper on the budget. The status quo is not a viable option. Reforming the budget is a political issue more than an accounting issue, and it is crucial if we want to overcome the challenges experienced by the European project, and if we want to relaunch the European Union after Brexit. There are areas of action where the added value of the European Union, which was mentioned by Commissioner Oettinger, is clear and is provable. Security, fight against terrorism, defense, climate change, migration and border control, and external border control, and investments in supranational strategic infrastructures. Now, if we act in a scattered way on these issues, we are rendering a very poor service to our citizens and to taxpayers of our own countries, because we waste resources. We'll waste resources of taxpayers, as the Commissioner said. And if we want to bring back these public policies to a European-wide framework, we have to be far-sighted in the European Union budget. Otherwise, there will be no relaunching of the European Union project, of the Community project. And these decisions have to concern the size of the budget, of the European budget, which must be connected to the issue of the added value of the Union, which is provable. And if it is proved, that is the way we should go, as the Commissioner said. And flexibility is key, because we have to respond to very rapid changes in this scenario. A mix in revenues, which must be added to the mechanism of the own revenues, because otherwise we should not stop this vicious mechanism of exploiting, of manipulating the net contributors, of manipulating this idea of who is the net contributor and who is the net recipient, and also believe we should improve the connection between the European Union and national parliaments. Now, we don't have much time to take these choices, to make these choices, but unless we make these choices, any projects to relaunch the Union will be dead. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Ms. Margarida Marques from Portugal.
Merci, Président. D'abord, merci à la présidence.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for the very pleasant evening we spent last night, and it gave us the possibility to discuss important matters in an informal setting. I would like to thank the Commissioner Oettinger and also Isabelle for their presentations, because I think we heard very well this dialogue between the Commission and the Parliament. I do understand how complicated this timetable is, because we are facing the parliamentary elections for the European Parliament. We have to prepare for the multi-annual framework, and it's a complicated situation. We know the situation is further complicated by Brexit. Although, as Isabelle reminded us, we can see from the resolution also possibilities regarding the own funds and the possibilities to increase the means. Now, if you look at the financing sources, this 1%, then it is clear that this is a share which is very hard to increase. But we are facing new challenges here, and we cannot handle these new challenges if we're not increasing the budget. The issue relating to defense is a good example, because all the member states have an obligation to participate in the activities related to NATO within 1%, but this kind of individual responsibility of the EU member states cannot be included in the EU budget. This is something we need to discuss. Another point is related to added value. We need to define the added value more, because we know that the cohesion is something which is related to added value. We need to find greater convergence so we can achieve these aims. And to conclude, one thing we need to handle during the next financing period is a possibility to add all these different aspects together. We are looking at the our competitivity and also convergence. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mr. Ivan Bartolo from Montenegro.
From Malta.
I'm really sorry.
It's okay, it's okay. Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me some time to contribute to this highly interesting debate. I would like to share with you my ideas on the reflection paper on the future of EU finances, which has initiated a hugely important debate, intricately linked to the future of our Union and what we seek to achieve through it. In this forum, I can highlight my member states' positive experience. Malta is one of many EU member states which receives more than it contributes to the EU budget, and this will remain to the cause throughout the financial period 2014-2020. In Malta, EU investments represent 2.6% of Malta's wealth. The largest share of the money that Malta receives from EU goes to the regional policy, 63% in 2013. In Malta, the funding is concentrated mainly on the fight against climate change, on transport, and on research. The positive impact derived from the investment goes well beyond the economic sphere, such as it strengthens social cohesion, thus having an overall positive impact on political stability and peace in the member state. Benefits which cannot be quantified or measured in sums. Dear colleagues, let us therefore not make short-sighted decisions. We need a strong EU budget for a stronger Europe that delivers for us all. The EU and national budgets serve different yet complementary purposes. The EU budget targets areas where EU money can generate added value and finances large-scale projects, which could not be carried out by a single member state alone. The costs from the EU citizen are minimal, approximately €1 per citizen. However, the benefits both for the individual, the MS and the EU as a whole are not to be underestimated or taken for granted. European investments are intended to benefit the EU as a whole, and the European funding in one country can benefit other EU members as well. We must show solidarity, especially during these uncertain times, when the UK's withdrawal will surely have an impact on the EU budget. If we want Europe to deliver better results for us all, each and every member state should increase its contribution. This is perhaps more difficult for some us to swallow, but in the longer term, it would yield better results for us and future generations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bartolo. Once again, I apologize for the mistake that I made before. Now, Mr. Jörgen Andersson from Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do believe that I, as a representative for a net contributing country, was addressed earlier by Mr. Oettinger. And he also had a lecture in what we find, in what way we find value added through EU budget expenditures. And let me start to declare, I do recognize the value of shared prosperity as for the dynamics in the economy it creates. And that is, of course, crucial for development and prosperity for the whole European continent, as well as for each nation and region. But there is a big but. I do not believe this can be accomplished through the EU budget. From my point of view, you put too much confidence to the EU budget expenditures to compensate for lack of reforms. I do not believe it can. This is where we differ. I wish we could instead discuss and put as much effort in reforms for better working labour markets, less regulations for enterprises, less protectionism, more trade, developing the single market, and this is examples of all we actually need to do, all a part of the EU budget. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mr. Stefan Radu Oprea from Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, the EU budget is one of the most powerful political messages. Therefore, an agreement about the future priorities is very important. Mr. Commissioner, your time frame proposal is very challenging, and I hope that you felt during your discussion from last week in Romania with our representative, including the national parliamentarians, that this will be one of the important tasks of the Romanian presidency. The future budget should ensure a fair approach between the new priorities and the traditional European policies that have already contributed to economic growth and jobs creation at EU level. A strong Europe still needs significant support for the founding objectives that are included in traditional policies for the benefit of all member states. Given that, the strong and sustainable economy is primarily based on reducing economic and social disparities, it is of utmost importance to maintain cohesion and agriculture policies at the heart of the European project and of the post-2020 MFF perspective, thus assuring for the traditional policies further funding. Cohesion policy should continue to be the main investment policy at the European level. Its architecture should be maintained, given the effectiveness of the existing common management model. In the meantime, both the Member States and the Commission should continue to work together to ensure greater visibility and better communication of the results of cohesion policy as an effective tool for regaining European citizens' confidence in the European project. To be more protective with the internal market will not solve the economical migration issue, which today is named social dumping. Solution is solidarity and the reduction of inequality in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mr. Fouad Ahidar from Belgium.
Merci. En tout cas, j'ai bien aimé l'échange qui ont...
Thank you very much. I did enjoy this exchange of opinions we heard between the Commissioner and Isabelle THOMAS, but I think it's also important to clarify the meaning of every word. If we talk about added value, then my question is that when I talk about it to the citizens, then the question is I pay for everything. I pay for the electricity and I pay for water, and if I feed myself, I pay for food. So where does the added value come from? So we need to pay for everything. So I think it's important to talk about things using correct terminology. For me, I don't have a problem with those who are wealthy. I have problems with those who are egoistic. So we think that in the EU we have these who should contribute more. We talk about 1%, but there are some who perhaps need to contribute less. During the previous discussion, we talked about the tax collection. We talked about 150 billion, which is not collected. So we have the means, and how is it possible that we know where these finances are? Because we're capable of calculating them, we can assess the value, but we have not been able to recover them. Yes, this year we could not get access to it. Why we couldn't get our hands on that money next year? So how exactly we can explain it on a national basis that we need more Europe? We see poverty, we see the unemployment. In the national parliament, we do have great difficulties because if the citizens do not believe in Europe and they don't have information about what the European funds are used for, then it's very hard to convince them in the need for more Europe. We need to inform our citizens, and one cannot be done without the other. So indeed, we can demand more finances, but we have to talk about where these means go.
Thank you. And now Ms. Kevi Kutra-Kukuma from Cyprus, please.
Thank you. The College of Commissioners last June decided to reserve a fund of 5.5 billion euro every year for the future of the common defense policy and the European Defense Fund. It is very clear that the European Union is following the difficult way without recognizing that economic and political powers are turning a blind eye on their real situations. They believe that by continuing austerity policies and the militarization of Europe will manage to stop the racist and chauvinist movement, which clearly have anti-Europe character. These xenophobic racist movements misuses the humanitarian crisis caused by neoliberal austerity policies to gain power and upgrade their role in the European society. To overcome these challenges, we need more democratic Europe and not a militarized Europe. And we should use budget to implement policies towards these directions, for example, to face the democratic challenges, the quality of life, and other issues. I wanted to ask also about the United States' decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate, and they continue to decide to go on cuts for the voluntarily contributions on various United Nations programs on humanitarian issues, like health, HIV control, children's AIDS, and other development programs. I wanted to know about our position, the European Union's position towards these programs to continue to support, and what is the real budget for these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I have to close the list for interventions, so we can leave a time for panelists. Okay, will be the last one. And now, Mr. Marius Mavrides, also from Cyprus, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to stand a little bit on the economic and social impact of the EU spending, and to ask the Commissioner whether there is a study to evaluate the results of the money spent on various areas, for example, research. Whether research has given us some results which are useful for the economy, useful for the society. And also whether the common agricultural policy is a better one than what the system was previously. Whether there are certain numbers which can be provided to us. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Joël Giraud from France, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. And first of all, in the introduction, the Commissioner Oettinger talked about the issue of rebates. And I think it is a very important issue. And as you know, France has never had a positive attitude when it comes to the rebate. So my question is that what is the solution that the European Commission is working on in order to reduce the rebates or withdraw them? Because without three times we have differentiated payments. We have the British rebates, of course, which will go after 2020. Then we have the flat rate rebates. And we have the exemptions in the VAT. So we know that this field is quite broad. There are many aspects here. So does the Commission have a financial or political approach to this entire topic of reduction of rebates? Now, the second question is concerning the scenarios on which the European Commission is working. So what are the minimum and maximum payments you're working on right now? And France is a net payer, and we have no rebates, and we are contributing 6 billion.
Thank you. And now Mr. Paulo Trigo Pereira from Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just some ideas. We know that budgets fulfill mainly three objectives: providing public goods, redistribution, and stabilization. And this can be done at the European level, at the national level, or at a regional level. So we have identified that we have a gap, both in terms of revenues due to Brexit and in terms of new expenditure needs. So the question and the approach that we should think of is what should be done at the national level and at supranational European level. And I just have two examples, time to talk about two examples. One is defense. Probably we should start thinking in countries when they move to the 2% of their expenditures on defense. Part of the expenditure will be national expenditure, but part of the expenditure and revenues should be go upwards to the European Union, in the sense that we cannot accept that additional expenditure on defense is expenditure that is taken off for other cohesion and inclusive growth or infrastructure investment on public goods. So this idea that some expenditures should go up and revenues should go up in the scale of the, let's talk, fiscal federalism in the European Union. And in the other way, second example is agriculture policy. We fully support the idea that there should be co-financing of direct payments for agriculture, because agriculture common policy, and I finish with this idea, have a stabilization implication, but have a perverse redistributive implication. So we are giving money, as the report mentions, 80% of financial support go to 20% of farms. So this is not what we want in the European Union, so we should move into this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Ms. Monica Michel from France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Un des grands défis qui se pose.
Thank you. One of the greatest challenges for the EU budget is, as has been mentioned already, how to do more with less. Migration, internal and external security are new challenges facing us. And defense policy is also an important sector. People have said that budget does not equal accounting. So I would like some explanations on the funds of the European Union, the means of the European Union that could be used in order to guarantee that every single euro spent from the budget is spent on achieving our objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mr. Momodou Jallow from Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me this opportunity. We ask our people to pay taxes, and we ask them to pay taxes because we want to make sure that we use that money to create some socioeconomic impact. We want to make sure that we use that money to create equity, close the gaps and disparities between different groups. But then I would like to echo some of the things that my delegation members said earlier on. We understand that Brexit complicates the budgetary situation for the EU. However, as it is already mentioned, Sweden pays a significant amount into the EU budget. And naturally, it is for us very important at this point to revisit how our taxpayers' money is utilized. One of the things that, for example, I can mention is that how structural funds are allocated to member states who are systematically undermining the very principles the EU claims to stand for. Or how, as it mentioned earlier on, this taxpayers' money would be used continuously and systematically to militarize Europe. That is something that we do not intend to use our taxpayers' money for. We intend to use our taxpayers' money to create equity, to close gaps, to create growth. And that is why it's extremely important at this juncture to really have a clear look at how we use this money and how we can somehow have an effective way of prioritizing some of the most important things that we think would give an added value. We talk about added value, but the question is added value for who? Added value for who and for what purpose? Because if militarization gives added value, I don't see that, and our taxpayers' money don't. Taxpayers do not see that. So it's very important for us to ask these questions ourselves. Why do we have to pay that amount of money, and yet we do not see the things that we really have an intention in saying? That's the question that I'm asking. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mr. Paolo Corrieri Paleotti from Italy. Sorry,
Could you hear me? Okay, thank you. Let me say first that I fully share the key suggestion stemming from both the presentation and many interventions in this session. In other words, that European money should be spent on things that deliver a clear European added value. In other terms, it means that we have turned the EU budget into a policy instrument which citizens could and will understand. And one should recall that European added value, together with subsidiarity, are the two fundamental principles upon which the European construction at its beginning was based. The reason to stay together were linked to the respect of those two basic principles, and we know that both principles in our budget in the past were mostly neglected. And a third, another violated principle, is the additionality of funds. As we know, mostly EU funds do replace national funds and not come as complement. Over 70% in the current financial framework is being used to replace national spending, so which means that European money is financing non-European policies. So let me wish that, even taking into account the scarce resources at our disposal, the new budget in the future could open a new path where these three basic principles, European value added, subsidiarity and additionality, could be better recognized than in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Mr. Ville Vähämäki from Finland.
Mr. Chair, what should EU budget focus on? I think innovations, 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 and then some added values. What we must understand that technology is moving so fast that we must be flexible, we must adapt. If we just think about financial technologies, it is challenging our banks, and still we are thinking about banking union. I think maybe physical banks may collapse in the future. We must focus on new innovations in EU budget. And actually, I think we must look what China is doing in their 5-year programs. I think EU must be flexible. The EU must have shorter programs than 7 years. Actually, I just want to note that we haven't seen nothing yet in cases of innovations. Thank you.
Thank you for all the interventions. And now I will give the floor back to the panelists and some remarks and comments. First of all, from Mr. Oettinger, please.
Dear colleagues, if I look at the many important comments that you've made, I feel right among you. You already have achieved unanimity because you, in your position, are against the proposal that will be presented by the Commission. Some of you say the numbers are too high, the revenues are too low, and the others say the expenditure is too high or too low. With this multi-voiced unanimity, we will never achieve an agreement. First and foremost, democracy versus militarism. This is nonsense. I'm sorry, this is ridiculous. We, as Europeans, do not invest enough in our security. The Baltic countries are greatly worried that something might happen on their borders. Solidarity for Europe's democracy and freedom might require a little bit more spending for defense and not less. America first means Europe nothing. Europe now has to finally grow up. If we do not focus on protecting our external security by increasing investment in police forces, cooperation and defense, if we do not do this, we will end up or we will end up asking ourselves how we will be better off 10 years from now. Militarism is the wrong word here. It's about defense, external security and independence, and that's what we would have to achieve not only within NATO, but also as non-NATO member European states. Otherwise, our children will at some point say they consumed too much in the present and did not invest enough in the future and in security. The idea of a defense union is so close. It's self-evident. If we propose 1 billion for the EU budget, which will then be supplemented by 4 from your budgets, so that we will end up with 5 billion, and we should be achieving 300 billion, i.e. 2% of our GDP would end up being 300 billion, then what we're proposing is a very small contribution. If not now, when then? Secondly, there's another concern that I also have. Migration versus cohesion. If we take migration, border protection, and the refugee situation and finance that by cutting funds in the cohesion field, then we will not make any progress. Where do the refugees want to go to? They want to go to Germany, Austria, the Netherlands. They want to go to Denmark and Sweden. And why? Because the quality of life is highest there, and the asylum legislation is the most attractive there, both from a material and from a procedural point of view. Nobody stays in Estonia, Bulgaria, or Poland. Nobody. But these countries need cohesion funds, and if somebody believes that we could solve the refugee problem by cutting funds on the cohesion side, then Europe will implode. Then we will have a new division. It was quite visible with regard to the refugee quota, and it becomes even more visible when we look at the budget. So I can only advise all of us to be extremely sensitive in this respect. We have to explain what we're doing with the European budget. I'm doing that day in, day out. I get a lot of invitations. I went to Stockholm just a couple of weeks ago, but my plea is, in order to explain the European budget, Ms. Thomas and the few EU parliamentarians and the commissioner aren't enough. We need you. The European budget is our common budget, and if you do not explain in each of your speeches what the projects are that are funded by the European budget, then we'll fail. You have to speak about Europe in your constituency, in your national parliaments, within your political parties. You don't speak a lot about the European budget. We speak more about pension funds for mothers or other national issues. Europe remains on the sidelines. We need you. I need you and your colleagues in order to enter into a discussion with our citizens and voters on the European budget. The voter. Now, in precise terms, 100 euros that are generated by a European citizen through their hard work and investments, we take away 50 euros on average with all of the levies, taxes, fees, etc. That's the average in Europe. In some countries it's 45, in others it's 55. So let's say 50 euros. Of the 50 euros that we take away from a citizen, 1 euro is directed at Brussels, to us ridiculous Eurocrats. So 49 euros remain in Berlin, Stockholm, Rome, Stuttgart, Vilnius, Breslau, in the communities, in the municipalities, and within the social system. So the European budget is 1/50th of the concerns and worries of the European citizens. 1/50th. I mean, we can realize better spending, but you can realize better spending as well, because you can realize 49 times more better spending than we can. We're just 1/50th of the problem. So my plea is, let's put things into the right perspective. 49 euros remain with you. 1 euro comes to us. Of $50, 25 go to Washington, D.C. And if you were to ask your citizens in Berlin or Stockholm, what do you think of the 50 euros? How much much goes to the idiots in Brussels, they would probably say 8 or 10 or 12. But it's 1. Nobody knows that. It's 1 out of 50. Now, the question of how can we finance new tasks. To just make this clear, we are willing to tackle the new tasks if you want us to. And by the way, there's no task that is determined by the Commission. Everything we are doing is decided by the Council, is decided by Parliament. Your governments have to give a majority approval of the things we are doing in Brussels. We don't come up with new ideas. The idea of defense is an old idea that is brought forward by the member states. It's the defense ministers of Germany and France who asked us to develop a vision of a defense union for Europe. Or migration. Do you actually believe that we could, in 2025, prevent refugees from coming here at the national level? These people are already born. They live in Africa, Mali, Libya, Palestine, Eritrea. And if we do not speak with one European voice when it comes to migration, we will end up being surprised about what's happening. Then what we're currently seeing will be just a whiff of what will happen then. The Africans will come in tens of the numbers that they're currently coming to us. Only a common European neighborhood and migration policy will be at least halfway effective when it comes to that. Then we should end cohesion. Now we're getting serious. The colleague from Malta very impressively described what cohesion policy is doing in Malta. Namely, it achieves social cohesion. It strengthens internal peace and internal cohesion between the member states. And I subscribe to that. Our host, Estonia, is an up-and-coming country, but I can tell you and show you what cohesion funds have achieved in Estonia with each and every euro that we spent here. So the added value can be proven. So we should be a union of competitiveness, but also of solidarity. Here in Estonia, it worked. In Latvia, Lithuania, it also worked. In Slovakia as well. I am not quite sure whether every cohesion project in the south of Italy was the right thing to do, but let's forget that. We have to probably improve our performance when it comes to the sustainability of projects, and that's why we introduced the idea of conditionality. We'd like to make the following proposal. Our European semester will be continued, and building on that, we build country-specific recommendations. And we have to improve in this respect. We have to link them earlier and in a better way with the national administrations. Where we work at a regional level, we have to cooperate with the regional administrations. But if that works, these recommendations could be a statutory blueprint for what the European cohesion funds can and should be earmarked for. I'm from Baden-Württemberg in Germany, and if we recognize there's not enough fiberglass broadband connections in Baden-Württemberg, we could say, okay, at least 20% of the European funds have to be earmarked towards the co-financing of 5G and fiberglass connections for a digital high-performing infrastructure in that region. So I want to make the following offer to you. Our country-specific recommendations should be coordinated more with your governments, with your parliaments, so that we can achieve a better outcome and avoid stranded investments. Demography was mentioned, health was mentioned, the depopulation of rural areas. These are all negative things. But with €1 from 50 euros, we will not be able to tackle these big issues. First and foremost, they remain within the responsibility of those who keep the 49 euros. Your task. So big expectations are sent to Brussels, but no money is sent to Brussels. That does not add up. We have 150 billion euros per year, 1% of the European GDP, 150. we spend between 50 to 55 billion on agriculture, and we can talk about whether this is the right way to do. The communication on the common agricultural policy will be presented in December. But agriculture, the production of food, of meat, wine, beer, that was the first communitized European task, which is and re-nationalizing this now would be the wrong way to pursue. We have an internal market in Strasbourg, in Lisbon, in Stuttgart. You can buy wine from Hungary, salami from Slovakia. So we have an open internal market, and that can only work if we jointly promote and support the rural areas and its agricultural production. And in order to do that, we need money. We will have some cuts, but I am absolutely against radical cuts here, because some member states would not participate in this anyway. So we have to achieve unanimity here. I would love to just fly home and ask you to stay in this room until you all unanimously support the next financial framework, because then I'd be on vacation, Ms. Thomas would be on vacation. It's similar to voting for a pope. We would have to ask you to stay in Estonia until Christmas and vote for a pope. A pope from Sweden to Malta, and that would be interesting. I am trying to make this possible, but my plea is have some confidence in us. Give us an opportunity, because when the British leave and we do not have a financial framework, the world would be laughing about us. We'd be a laughingstock, and the project Europe would, I believe, no longer be viable for the future. And then one question focused on Brexit. What is that? Now, our calculations, at least 12 billion, sometimes up to 15 billion. It's not always that easy to come up with a definitive figure. Why? If a bridge is built together with Great Britain and a European company wins the tender, then we have a supplier from Great Britain who is held in its majority by a Spanish company, then it's very difficult to sort out the money. Or Horizon 2020, if the Max Planck Institute participates in Oxford, then part of the money goes to Oxford, part of the money goes to Germany, so very difficult to sort this out. So we can say at least 10 billion, maybe up to 15 billion net that we will be losing out on. And then the question of rebates, discounts. As a commissioner, I'd like to propose no rebates at all. I am well aware of the fact that in long nights of negotiations we'll end up with maybe 1 or 2 rebates in order to make it possible for 1 or 2 governments to give their consent in the first place. But the complexity of rebates that we currently have is way too much. There might be 3 people alive who understand how the rebates work. One is sitting in Brussels, the other is in a retired old age pension home, and the third suffers from dementia. But if the British rebate goes, all rebates should go, so that you have as little new rebates as possible. Then there was the indirect question concerning a Eurozone budget, as Mr. Macron suggested. I have certain hesitations here. As long as we have gaps in the main budget, we should not make available money for a Eurozone budget. You have to build a house, foundation, first floor, and then you can start working on the roof, but not the other way around. And 3 to 4% of a Eurozone budget is something that I believe to be unrealistic. 3 to 4%. I mean, with a 3% Eurozone budget, just France, would have to introduce 66 billion euros. I don't believe that's possible. The Eurozone budget was developed in 2011 with 16 members of the Eurozone at that time and 28 member states. Today, 19 Eurozone members and 27 member states. So a Eurozone budget would be 85% of the entire European GDP. So should we tell 8 countries, just because of 15%, that you are outside of the group, and 2 or 3 of them are thinking about joining the Eurozone anyway? So I am making the plea for a stronger primary budget and for the establishment of tools that can be helpful for Eurozone and non-Eurozone countries, but I'm not for a Eurozone on top as long as we have gaps in the current European budget. This would be another danger of driving a wedge into the European family. It is correct that cohesion is sometimes offset against reforms. So reforms need to happen, but again, they're not those countries that carry out reforms and those that don't. They are not the competitive countries and those that are unwilling to be competitive. What Portugal has achieved in the past years is outstanding. What Ireland has done is remarkable. Cyprus as well. And I can say what the Greeks had to suffer through was something that in affluent countries would have led to a revolution. So we believe that in the next months we will have to just try to achieve unanimity. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this answer. Hopefully someone has to leave, but anyway, we have Ms. Thomas, and 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Je me rends compte, en fait, en écoutant les parlementaires nationaux que nous devrions...
Thank you very much. Having listened now the representatives of national parliaments, I noticed that we need to really meet more often. It is so important that we will be able to exchange our ideas, share our ideas, our way of thinking, and we do not have many possibilities. To the Swedish delegation, I would like to say that I'm going to go to the Swedish Parliament on the 6th of December, and I believe we should definitely meet, because I would like to answer to you especially. So I agree with you, with the Swedish Parliament. I have many other things, I'm sure, but in one thing specific, definitely, that it is not possible to increase the contribution of the member states because the national budgets are already under pressure right now. But at the same time, we cannot say that we would not be able to increase the contributions of the member states, but at the same time, we don't want to increase our own financing either. This is what we're talking about in all the presentations. Everybody has their own priorities and their own objectives. So if you look at the country by country, if you look at the political group by political group, their priorities are not the same. But if we need to build things together, we need to listen to the priorities of the others, because some would say that defense is not a priority. The others would think it is. Some think that agriculture is not a priority, and some would think it's the food security is extremely important. And then the reception of the migrants, for some it's a priority, for some it is not. So there are many topics, and I'm sure this is something you have noticed as well. We have all seen that there are different ways of seeing things and different understandings, and living together means we need to share our priorities. And to summarize, I'm going to say it in the most friendly way, and I hope that we can do it together on the 6th of December in Stockholm, that when it comes to the European Union budget, line by line, I can prove it to you that we cannot continue like this. We need to reduce the funding for scientific research, which is one of the most important ones, gives us best results. We have to reduce investment policies, investments to the infrastructure, Connecting Europe facility. But there are things, of course, which function well, but I'm not going to, of course, complain about anyone right now. But we have seen some ministers of certain EU countries who sign documents where the objective is to reduce the youth unemployment. But if it's something to do with Europe, then you say, no, it was just a minister's signature about this of the labor minister, but it doesn't, but the Minister of Finance does not concur, and so this is not funding which we can provide. But all of this requires an exchange of ideas and thoughts. And with the condition which refers to, with this question which refers to conditionality, especially when it comes to these countries which do not follow the principles and rules of the EU, then we continue this work. We continue this in my own political group as well. But it was very good that you mentioned it. Now, at the same time, we think about the need for sanctions, but we cannot really sanction the cohesion policy because there are some countries which are implementing the cohesion policy, but these policies are not necessarily in accordance with the opinions of other member states. So we have to find a common ground. And I would like to conclude with my response regarding the efficiency of the budget. And this is something we often ask the European Parliament as well. We need to exchange our ideas. Everything needs to be transparent. If we look at the structural funds, for example, we have a 3% margin right now, which is not much, because 15% of the budget goes for investment. So everything is transparent, and there is no need for additional proof here, at least not for the members of the European Parliament. I can tell you the efficiency is higher, especially it's only 1%. Now, if we compare this to the US federal budget, then that's 20% of the GDP. And to conclude, I do hope that we can exchange our ideas more often and have a continuous discussion on the matters which are important for us. We need more of this. We need to do it on a monthly basis rather than having this just this conference on the interparliamentary level. And perhaps we from the European Parliament, we need to travel more. Of course, we do it quite a lot, but I believe that we need to institutionalize this exchange of our thoughts and to introduce our objectives to each other. And I would like to thank the organizers once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thoma. And I'm glad to give the floor to Mr. Märt, who is a Deputy Ministry of Finance and also responsible for the European Union budget negotiations nominated by Estonian government. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Commissioner and Isabelle, for your passionate conclusions. I'm going to be very brief, also for the reason that the member states have not actually yet started structured discussions on the next MFF. So the initiative is actually at the side of the Commission at this point, in which sense it was extremely brilliant that Mr. Commissioner gave such a lengthy and passionate talk about these issues. The actual true discussions on the issue will fall upon our dear Bulgarian, Austrian, and other colleagues to follow our presidency. So I will just give you very brief, three very brief remarks from our national perspective, rather. Agreeing to a very large extent to things that Mr. Commissioner was saying earlier on, I would add that going forward, looking at the structural reform parts that the EU budget should also be induced to, we shouldn't forget the monetary anchor at the end of the convergence process, meaning the single currency, which is still a currency of the European Union. Second, what we're trying to do increasingly is tackling new challenges that go way beyond the national abilities to react with the old budget. While EU is a perfect structure to deal with cross-national risks like migration flows or climate change, but the budget is really old, so that is something that the new budget framework ideally should address to. It would involve something that is extremely difficult, is both scaling up and scaling down the current budget expenditure items. And the third thing that I sort of repeatedly run into in my current task as trying to agree on a very small task on 2018 annual budget together with Isabelle and the colleagues in the Parliament is the budget rigidity. In a worst case, what it introduces is, in addition to rebates that the Commissioner was talking about, it also introduces an involuntary rebates, which we see this year actually 7.7 billion euros being sent back to the Member States because the funds have been unused. The Member States have not been able to use them, mostly in structural funds. So that rigidity and these sort of outcomes that pose an extreme legitimately risks to the claims that the EU budget should be increased. These should be somehow structurally dealt with in the next MFF framework. But with that, I'll leave it to Remo to wrap up the extremely interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. KIVINE. Thank you for all the participants and panelists for this really passionate discussion. I think we have earned big applause. Ladies and gentlemen, during the past 2 days we've had an opportunity to discuss the future of EMU and the fiscal compact, as well as what should the governments do to make economy work better regarding the national reforms, financial assistance and investment programs. This morning we had a really good discussion about how to collect taxes in more efficiently and how to keep up with the digital economy. And we just ended a discussion about various challenges that the EU budget is facing. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the keynote speakers during last 2 days and to the delegates for constructive contributions and debates during 2 days. Colleagues, it's our pleasure to email you the links to the photos, video summary of the conference, and we will do it tomorrow, so you will receive that information. Next week, we will also send you a short summary of the conference. The photo and video materials will be made available as soon as possible on parleu2017.de webpage and on Riigikogu Flickr account and on YouTube as well. I would like to thank you all for attending the conference and for your active participation. And also would like to thank all the other people who were involved with organizing this conference. Thank you for them as well. So.